Throughout your life, you will be presented with temptation paths, paths that take you away from what it is that you're meant to be doing with your life. And oftentimes, these paths appear as a mirage, offering you the world. And if you're not attuned to them, aware of them, know how to avoid them, you can end up walking down these paths and end up regretting it later on in life. And so in this video, I want to explore and explain 3 different personalities that are vulnerable to temptation paths. And my name is Joel Yuli. I'm a philosopher. I am deeply obsessed and immersed in helping people to know what their vocation is in this world. And that's why I do this education on social media platforms like YouTube, Instagram. I have a podcast called the Career Archetypes Podcast. I share writings on Substack. And I help people to unearth their career archetype and choose the right career path with conviction in our Unearth membership. And one of the big common themes for people is this idea of temptation paths, paths that pull them away from the actual calling. And they can often be hard to decipher. Some temptation paths pull us because, hey, they pay the bills. And it may not be a soul-led calling, but at least I'm able to put food on the table. Some temptation paths pull us in a way where it seems as though, like, this is it, this is my purpose, this is what I'm meant to be doing. Only for a couple of years in, maybe even a couple of months in, it all dissipates and we end up realizing this isn't all that I thought it was going to be. This dream that I had, this dream job that I pursued wasn't what I thought it was going to give me in return. And so they end up realizing they've walked down some sort of path that wasn't actually for them. And I'm reminded of a story of Hercules. So Hercules in mythology was said to have been walking down this road one day, and he's walking down this road, and it's a straight road, only to be met with it splitting in two. And there's no exact signage posts around telling him whether to go left or whether to go right. Instead, he's met with 2 goddesses on either side of this splitting of the road. And he meets with these goddesses and they start vying for his attention, almost asking him for their vote of confidence so that they can walk down their side of the road. One goddess to the left starts to tell him that, hey, if you go down this direction, if you walk down my lane, then you'll be met with a life of ease, a life of comfort. Sit back and relax, chill out on the couch, watch some shows, here's a phone, scroll through your social media, and life will just be a cruise. And she starts to ask him to go down this road in order to pursue this life of ease and comfort. And Hercules starts to think about it, like, oh, that sounds pretty nice, that sounds pretty sweet. Maybe I should go and turn left and live a life of comfort. And then he's met with an alternative opinion, the goddess to the right of him. And the goddess to the right starts to tell him, like, hey, my path isn't easy. My path is full of hardship. It's full of suffering. It's also full of challenges. However, it will provide you with the necessary adventure that will create and cultivate you into somebody that can turn into a god of the stars, that you will be able to live a life that has a legacy within it, a life that you can be proud of. You will be able to reach your potential to meet your exalted form. And so in that moment, Hercules is met with a decision. He's met with 2 potential paths to walk down. And so the question is, which path is the temptation path? Now, we all have to deal with temptation paths. They happen all the time. They will pop up and they will tell you that, hey, if you just pursue this avenue, maybe you'll get some financial security. If you just pursue this avenue, well, maybe at least you'll have the correct steps in place. If you go and get this degree, then you'll know that after that degree, you can go and get an internship at this place with your parents, a friend that recommended you. There are all these different paths out there that are laid out that might pull us in to say, like, oh, this could be the road. However, the actual path itself needs to be both understood in order to begin walking the path, as well as contrasted against these different temptation paths. And so I wanted to tell you about these different personality types that are particularly vulnerable to temptation paths and why. So I've named these 3 different personalities as the first one, the parent pleaser, the second one, the shackled dreamer, and the third one, the numbed ones. So let's go over the parent pleaser and it's in the name. The parent pleaser wants to please their parents. They have often been brought up in a circumstance whereby the ties within their culture and the ties within their family unit are incredibly tight. It's very common for people that have been born into these circumstances to have parents that have gone through hard and difficult times. Maybe their parents have immigrated interstate or overseas, and they had to find their footing in the world. And their parents might say to them, I just want you to have a better life than I did. I want you to walk this particular kind of path because I know that if you walk this particular kind of path, you're not going to have to deal with the hardships that we had to deal with. And so they offer them this very particular type of life that they believe is better suited for them because they're contrasting it against their own hardships and their own challenges, not realizing that their child has to develop themselves and has to hear their own internal calling. And so there's almost this sort of guilt that's passed on that if you do not pursue this path, then you're at risk. And as a parent, believing that their children is at risk, they want to make sure that they avoid that, and yet they're not allowing that child to mature and to move forward. And so these people that are found in this space, they end up walking down paths that aren't meant for them. They want to make sure that their parents can receive, they knowing that they will be safe, that they will be okay, even to the point where their parents are able to boast and to tell their friends that, hey, my child has this job or has that job. And they can use this as a sort of way to uplift themselves in status. And so it's also very common for these people to have jobs that are high status within the societal constructs that we find ourselves in. To have jobs that are ones where at a party where you were to tell somebody what it is that you do, they're like, whoa, that's really cool that you're a doctor and you're able to, perform these sort of operations based on the thing that you studied for 7+ years. And yet underneath, they know that it's not quite for them. It's not quite the actual path that they wanted to pursue. An alternative to the people pleaser is the experience whereby they have parents that aren't very useful or aren't very helpful and aren't very nurturing. And they grew up in a place where their parents were always disregarding them, pushing them to the side, saying that they weren't good enough, they didn't live up to certain expectations. And this also creates a similar expression in the world whereby they're constantly chasing the status, they're constantly trying to uplift themselves in culture as if by doing so, they will somehow be able to receive their parents' love, and it never quite happens. And so there's this sort of dark cycle that occurs where they're constantly trying to help their parents and to validate their parents, but in doing so, they disassociate from themselves and they lose themselves in the process. And not only are they not attuned to their own calling, but they're walking someone else's calling to the point where they might even consciously become aware that, hey, this isn't my path, but I can't really do anything about it now because to leave, to try something else is to disrupt the fabric of the family unit or to never receive the love that I really want deep down. And there's this sort of sad side whereby it's almost tragic in the sense of wishing that, hey, maybe next life I will be born to a better bloodline. Now, as I'm saying these different personalities and describing them and telling you that they are very vulnerable to these types of temptation paths, know that no temptation path is a dire situation. No one that has temptation paths can't avoid them and get off of them and find their own calling. It's just that these particular personalities will often veer off a lot easier than some others. Now, the second personality that I wanted to mention was the shackled dreamer. They have many dreams, big dreams, small dreams that are so useful in the way in which they're able to self-inspire. The problem, though, is that they're often shackled to some sort of paycheck, normally some sort of weekly paycheck, and they have held themselves back. So potentially they've fallen into this job, fallen into this path, because maybe a friend recommended it, maybe they saw it on a LinkedIn ad, maybe they, just heard about it on some sort of like Facebook group. And now here they are in a path that initially they thought, hey, this was a beginning path, or this was something that I can do for now, and eventually I'll be able to leave. But they start getting addicted to that weekly email that says, hey, your pay has arrived, the pay that you need in order to support your rent or your mortgage or to help feed your family is there. And they get so used to that consistent coming in of that weekly money that they become incredibly connected to it. So much so that to leave it, to even potentially sever it, brings forth this sense of anxiety, brings forth this sense of worry, brings forth this sense of, I could never go out there because it's too risky, it's too destabilizing. And so what ends up going on is that they end up having these different dreams of what they could be doing, what they could be living, and will never go and take the steps to actually make it happen unless they unshackle themselves from this position of absolute certainty. Whether that's going back to school to study, whether that's going and transitioning into an organization that feels deeply aligned with their own personal values or allows them higher growth. Maybe they're capped at the current place that they're at. That allows them potentially to go out there and start their own business and do something that feels deeply fulfilling. They have to unshackle themselves and actually take some steps out in the world. But for the shackled dreamers, that is their own personal challenge. And because of that, they are susceptible to paths that give them the sense of consistent security at the forefront and even to the detriment of any other facet of their own maturity being able to come forth. And so they have to navigate that. Now, the third personality that I want to mention is the numbed ones. And the numbed ones are often deeply unattuned to their own personal tastes, their own personal inclinations, and their own personal interests. Now, they may have many different interests, passions, and find themselves getting pulled and allured to many different things. But there was some point whereby they lost the discernment as to which one of their passions or which couple of passions really stand apart from the rest. And so they're not quite sure of themselves. There's a loss or a disengagement of their own personal inner knowing. And they can get really caught up in trends. You often find the numb ones falling for different trendy paths out in the world. If suddenly everyone out in the world is pursuing a Bookstagram account and earning a living from reviewing books, they start getting pulled by that. If suddenly everybody is becoming a social media brand manager or brand designer, even though they're not really attuned to that in a deep way, they might start getting pulled towards that. And it's because they have all these different passions and all these different interests, but they're not actually self-attuned in such a way where they can say, like, these few right here, 1, 2, and 3, they are the most important. All these other ones, like, they sort of are interesting to me, but these few, they are the ones that strike me, that strike a chord within me, that want me to follow them. And the more and the deeper that they get into understanding their own tastes, the more they're able to realize that many of the paths that are initially shiny, that want to seduce them and tell them, hey, come be a brand designer, and yet they don't want to use their creativity in that way, the more that they can develop that taste allows them to be able to walk their actual path. And so they are most susceptible to the trendy paths, to the poppy paths, to the paths that you see on social media. Maybe they're not even really deeply attuned to running their own business because they see it on the internet so much. They start being like, oh, maybe that is for me. Maybe everyone should be doing that. And so they can lose that sense of self in that process. And the way for them to really avoid their own temptation paths is to develop that sense of taste, to be able to sternly and convictedly say, I like that thing, I don't like that thing. I'm pulled towards that thing, I'm pulled towards that other thing more. To understand the spectrum of how much they get pulled in by these areas of life, these passions, these interests. And so these are these 3 different personalities, and they all have their own temptation paths, and they can all be avoided. And oftentimes it's through going and confronting the painful act of shedding or moving away from the path that they're comfortable with. If you were to think about the first personality, the parent pleaser, you can simply think about them having to disrupt potentially the household, to leave the parents' validation to the side and say that I'm going to walk my own path. And if you love me, then you should be someone that vouches for me as I walk my true path. If you look at the numbed ones and you're to think about how they are able to make sure that they avoid temptation paths, it's about developing their own personal taste. If you look at the personality of the shackled dreamer, it's about really attuning themselves to the dream, grounding that dream in reality, and then beginning to unshackle themselves from the current weekly paycheck to the area of life or the area of a particular job that they don't want to pursue, and say, how can I actually take the practical steps in order to make that real? What structure do I need in order to be able to walk that path? And by doing that, they can slowly transition out. And they don't have to do it in a way that completely upheaves their life in a singular moment. They can slowly transition out. And so if we come back to the story of Hercules, who is at this crossroads or the split of the road, thinking about the two types of lives he ends up living, I mean, you would know which one he ended up choosing because I'm telling you this tale of his great choice, which is going down towards the path of hardship, of challenges, because he was set for a life of adventure, not a life of comfort, but a life of adventure, a life of legacy, a path where he could realize who he is and who he could become, and to inevitably end up being planted and placed in the stars. And if you are interested in learning more about how to choose your own path, how to know which paths in the world are your temptation paths, how to avoid those temptation paths, and how to unearth your career archetype and walk your path with conviction, then I'll leave a link under this video where you can go out and check the Unearth membership. In there, it's a community, it's a course. The course goes for 8 weeks and it guides any member through the process of how to unearth their career archetype and choose the right career path with conviction. And so if you're interested in that, check out the link below.